Now, we've all had the odd daydream about becoming a dictator. Shut up, yes, you have. The idea that if you were to take the reins of absolute power in your country, that you would unquestionably be a force for good upon the land. A mere nobody who, through divine providence or just a smidge of good fortune, becomes an enlightened, benevolent, and caring autocrat who would set the world right and have no need for checks and balances. Because I'm not like the other girls, I'm different. Of course, this is nothing new. The road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions, because power is famously corrupting after all. But today's topic is all about that. Sure, power may corrupt normal people, but what happens when absolute power is given to an eccentric schizophrenic with a sub 100 IQ? Well, simply put, it enables them. But it also makes for a really interesting story. I know that a lot of you have heard a lot of mental stories about dictators around the world, and you most likely have never heard of this guy, but trust me, you want to hear this one. Francisco Macias Nguema, the monster of Malibu. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. Africa. We all know it and we all love it. The mind-bogglingly large landmass that houses countless biomes, animals, tribes, and mysteries. A veritable goldmine of stories and tales that are evidently showcased in some of my other previous videos. So, it should come as no shock to any of you that the European powers of the day gazed upon the dark continent with a mixture of fear and fascination, with the scramble for Africa being, amongst other things, an anthropological loot crate that everyone fawned and swooned over. From the big boys that we all know and love, like Britain and Germany, to the other ones, like Portugal, France, Italy, and some other fucking made-up place called Belgium. Everybody wanted a slice. Even the haughty, moralising, and holier-than-thou Yankees had their own wee corner of imperial pride in Liberia. Though, that is a whole story for another time. So, when Africa had been adequately scrambled in the closing years of the 19th century, we finally begin our tale in earnest, in the Spanish colony of what is now Equatorial Guinea. Yes, Spain did have colonies in Africa, because they heard there was gold to mine and natives to butcher. Now, this is a short thing just to keep note of. Spanish Guinea is made up of two distinctive parts. The island of Fernando Po, which is now called Bioko, which is the capital of the country, and was by far the most developed. And then Rio Muni, a small little appendage on the African mainland that was given to the Spanish from Portugal so that they would stop fucking with Brazil. It's functionally an afterthought in Equatorial Guinean affairs, with a minuscule population and somehow even less infrastructure. I'm bringing this up now because it highlights just how out of the way this little Castilian fiefdom really was, being an absolute backwater even for Africa. And frankly, it's a bit weird. Like, imagine if the US capital was Honolulu and the majority of the country's population was in Hawaii. And if they were all basically Hispanic Haitians. Shut up, the Dominican Republic doesn't count. Back on topic, in the mainland province of Rio Muni, we see the birth of Mzee Nguema to a family in the Isangwe clan. They're not important, but it is necessary to bring up as their clan got kicked out of the Gabon for being ethnic fangs. What the fuck do all of these cultural terms even mean? Why do these groups hate each other? What is even the difference between these groups? Why do all of their alliances and hatreds change every 2 weeks? Welcome to Africa. Okay, that's all well and good, but where did they settle? Well, they moved to the border city of Mongomo. Yes, it's really called that, where he could hopefully grow up and have a relatively normal childhood with his fellow Mongos. However, not quite, because you see, Nguema was especially prone to sickness as a boy, often being the victim of multiple spells of tuberculosis and other such medieval maladies. To showcase just how dicey, rough, and fucking fruity Nguema's upbringing was, you need only look at his brother, who died at a young age. And how did he die? Well, apparently he was fucking sacrificed because one of their parents was a fucking witch doctor, and by God, they needed those African rains blessed. I fucking love Africa so much. Due to the harsh environment that Nguema found himself in, paired with the brushes with death that he almost succumbed to on multiple occasions, he ended up developing a crippling lifelong fear of his own mortality. After all, when a young person like him has such traumatic and harrowing events play out constantly, they naturally dwell upon the metaphysical. So, he did. And where did he end up? Well, in the hands of the church, of course. Because of the nature of Spanish imperialism, the influence of the Catholic Church was, and still pretty much is, very widespread throughout the region. It was here that Mez got his education in a Catholic school, which definitely helped him with his neuroticism. It probably helped him so much that he changed his name from Mez to Francisco Macias Nguema. And he became a true God-fearing Catholic, based, and he learned Spanish, not so based. Nguema even took up employment as a servant for wealthy Spanish settlers, which he was apparently quite good at, though there was a little bit of an issue with it. It kind of put him at odds with the notably not Catholic and not Spanish Fang people, which included most of his own family. Because of this state of constant conflict between his ethnic heritage and his chosen faith, paired with the fact that Nguema was already a smidge mentally unstable, he garnered something of an inferiority complex towards the Spaniards of all people. And yes, Francisco was already showing signs of being a nutty fucker, well before his time as the equatorial autocrat. According to French intelligence reports, Francisco was already riddled with venereal diseases and multiple mental afflictions by the time he was employed, hurried along by his habit of, amongst other things, eating weed. Yeah, he didn't smoke it, he ate that shit raw like it was stinky kale. And he was also rather fond of locally grown hallucinogenics that were made into potions that he would then drink. This combination of chewing hash and drinking Joe Rogan juice on top of already having a bunch of mental illnesses meant that his psyche just kept unravelling more and more. But we won't really see the effects of that until later. But that aside, by the time the 1930s came around, Spain wasn't doing too hot, to say the least, with some minor domestic issues niggling at the imperial core that kept the country preoccupied. Having to deal with a completely unrelated Francisco that has no real bearing on history and definitely isn't a fascinating character worth a video. But out in Spanish Guinea, our Francisco was repeatedly failing exams to get into the civil service. After 4 attempts and a sizable amount of brown-nosing the right officials, however, he did eventually succeed, becoming a clerk in the colonial administration that, functionally speaking, meant that he was a Jani for all 12 of the Spanish people in the country. Continuing his colonial glazing, he eventually went through a series of promotions that ranged from being a court interpreter to a forest worker, then a public works official in Rio Bonito, a catechist, and a presumed myriad of other random jobs that he did as a clerk, because realistically he was probably the only native that the Spanish had on hand at any given time. And as such, he had to do everything. Come 1961, Nguema was embedded with the Equatorial Guinean delegation to Madrid. It was here that he had the opportunity to meet that other Francisco that I mentioned earlier, who by this point was something of a big deal in Spain. Now, being a native collaborator, religious convert, and colonial lapdog, one might assume that our Francisco was fully invested in the Spanish imperial project. However, no, as despite the fact that he harboured no real ill will towards the Spanish, he was still a nationalist who was trying to peacefully push for the gradual independence of Spanish Guinea, a la an autonomous dominion, like what Canada should be. I'm just saying, everything that went wrong with that fucking country can be accurately charted to when they adopted that fucking leaf as their flag, and also started LARPing as neutered Americans. Tangent aside, whilst Francisco was doing his duties as a court interpreter, he had realised that his skills in translations made him functionally the arbiter of truth in the judicial system. As such, he started taking bribes off of people in order to influence the nuanced language of his translations. This resulted in him being functionally able to absolve or condemn anyone he wanted, all because he was the one native Fang that learned to speak Spanish. Meaning, he could make up whatever shit he wanted in translation because there was no one else around that could correct him. A guy could give a 10-minute speech in court giving an ironclad alibi, and Francisco could just say, "Your Honour, he just pleaded guilty, also he said your mum's a hoe." The Spanish administration saw Francisco's wide catalogue of judicial assistance in condemning a whole host of people, and naturally concluded that he was a super trustworthy, loyal and talented statesman. As such, he got given another round of promotions, like assistant interpreter, mayor of his hometown Nguema, then the Minister of Public Works. It was by this point that Spanish Guinea was undergoing a change. It was no longer to be a colony of Spain. That's right, my chuds, Equatorial Guinea was to become Spain. Yes, the Spanish government started the process of formally annexing and integrating Equatorial Guinea as an integral part of Spain, like what France's relationship with Algeria fucking should be. I mean, yous fucking might as well at this point. Seeing as now Francisco and everyone else in the formerly Spanish Guinea are full-blown Spaniards post-annexation, you would think that everything would just go swimmingly. Well, no, not quite, because despite the fact that they were now symbolically annexed and made a self-ruling province of Spain, it functionally changed absolutely nothing in day-to-day governance. And it merely delayed the inevitable decolonisation of the country at the cost of further pissing off the already militant separatist groups operating in the area. In steps Francisco, the mentally deranged crypto-nationalist that kept falling upwards because he was Spain's number one guy apparently. He just got promoted again, this time to deputy president for the region. And for the record, the previous 3 promotions were all in the same year as this. And then to boot, he also served in the local parliament. Of course, by 1964, the writing was on the wall. Spain was going to have to decolonise from the region. As such, they had established a native-led transitory government to oversee the gradual withdrawal of Spain. So, who do you think they went to for Deputy PM? That's right, our boy Francisco. So, by this point, Francisco is just going onwards and upwards, just hustling his way to the levers of power through some good old-fashioned corruption. But here's the thing. People started to notice something about Francisco. Something that made everyone very, very concerned, especially since this man was about to be handed a lot of power over the whole country. And what they noticed is that Francisco Nguema was a fucking nutter. During a conference in Madrid designed to discuss the future of the colony, Nguema said some rather choice words on the panel. He described himself as a Hitlerian Marxist, detailing how the angry mustache man was actually a divine liberator of the African continent, wishing to save the black man from the clutches of the white cave beasts, and that a spell of presumed Jewish confusion resulted in Hitler instead invading and occupying Europe instead of Africa. He thought Hitler occupied parts of Europe instead of Africa by mistake. So, in other words, Nguema was an unironic Afro-Nazbol. Africa gives me so much fucking content. I mean, I'm not surprised in the slightest. The fact that he was saying shit like that and still kept his job just goes to show that the Spanish do indeed have a sense of humour, and that they were Machiavellians at heart who wanted to do a little bit of trolling before fucking off from the continent. Kind of like leaving an unflushed giant diabolical shit in the pan before you move out because your landlord was a bit of an arsehole. Feeling his own mind slipping, Nguema booked himself into the Madrid-based Rubin Clinic to try and get his prescription of normal pills. This may sound like a good sign that he is willing to improve his behaviour and not be an absolute fucking schizo, but no, not quite. Now, keep in mind that throughout everything that we are going to discuss in this video, that Nguema was lucidly aware that his sanity was slowly slipping. Right, he knew that the visions he was having and the delusions he was having and the voices he was hearing and all of that stuff were all because of his mental illness. He was fully fucking aware that he was insane. Yet, he decided to do all of the things that we're about to discuss anyway. That is far, far more insidious than if he was just an unaware goofy goober that was wrestling with these shadow people's mind powers. After returning from Malibu moderately medicated, he hastily prepared himself for the 1968 Spanish-Guinean election, which would functionally be the election to decide who would lead the country into independence. And to the surprise of absolutely none of you, Nguema won, utilising a Spanish lawyer to ghostwrite his speeches and make him sound all smart-like, and utilising the tried-and-true African method of realpolitik. Pointing at white people's houses and asking the sub-80 IQ illiterati if they would like to own it. Yes, I am being completely serious, he actually did literally that. He was further bolstered by his completely legitimate and not at all suspicious receiving of the Collar of the Order of Civil Merit and the African Civil Order. He was awarded these for being such a good guy during his colonial tenure, but let's be entirely realistic, the timing for these is a little bit too opportune. Upon gaining the presidency, Nguema initially tried to be cordial with the Spanish, but post-signing of the independence agreement, he began to hold some rather Europhobic positions. He claimed, for instance, that the Spanish had a hand in multiple ongoing coup attempts against him, supposedly supporting the likes of rival Bonifacio Ondu Edu. Out of complete coincidence, Edu then fled to Gabon. What are the chances of that? And for what it's worth, upon being extradited back to the country, he was immediately arrested and then officially killed himself after being held in the infamous Black Beach prison, which is very in vogue for political dissenters nowadays. What a trendsetter. It's even more amazing because that guy's wife also killed herself as well. What are the chances? And it turns out that our Nguema wasn't what we would call a frugal leader, because within just months of getting into power, he had somehow managed to drain the coffers of the entire country. Yes, he spent the wealth of an entire fucking country in just a few months. This was made worse by the fact that by this point, the country lacked its own currency, so they had to rely on the Spanish minting them pesetas and, most importantly, the Spanish following through with prior agreed upon terms during the independence negotiations. And, spoiler alert, the Spanish flaked. This resulted in government officials not being paid, which is really bad for a normal country, but for an African nation, that is near cataclysmic in damage. So, what did this result in? Well, in March of 1969, there was a supposed coup attempt against Nguema led by his own foreign minister, one Atanasio Ndongo Mione. Nguema managed to deftly and tactfully defuse the attempt at a forced cabinet reshuffle by diplomatically putting Mione through a window. That wasn't some little clever play on words about some bureaucratic magic show. No, Nguema literally threw him out of a fucking window 3 stories up and he fell to his death. Welcome to African politics, son. But his political wiles went even further than mere defenestration, as upon going downstairs, he went out onto the street and took a picture of Mione's dead body to show off to the international press, because, like any true politician, he was very savvy to voter perceptions, and the message that he wanted to send to the voters was, support me or end up like this fucking pancake. Seeing as Spain had seemingly refused to honour their side of an economic agreement with Guinea, Nguema decided that this was just grounds to treat the mutually agreed upon constitution as voided. So he then proceeded to do what Africans do best when in such spats with the white man. He had a shit fit and he started stealing. Nguema proceeded to create a major diplomatic incident, resulting in the Spanish government having to step in and evacuate all nationals in the country, which was estimated to be around 7,500 people, alongside the panicked withdrawal of the leftover civil guard. Kind of like Rhodesia, or the Congo, because they obviously had to come up at some point. With the country in a state of complete chaos, Nguema decided to once again dwell upon his mental state. Just like last time, he made his way to Barcelona to seek psychiatric advice. And did he get the help that he needed? No, of course he fucking didn't. In fact, it arguably made him much worse. His drug consumption fucking skyrocketed after this, and he got orders of magnitude worse right in time to solidify his complete control of the country. Speaking of which, on Christmas Eve of 1969, after the Spanish emergency sizzled out, we see Nguema getting into a festive spirit. He gathered 186 of his former enemies and in true Dickensian fashion had them huddled into the Malabo football stadium, all to the tune of Those Were the Days by Mary Hopkins playing on the loudspeakers. Yes, really. And with a jovial hip and hooray, he had all of them fucking executed. 150 of them who were supposedly involved in a coup plot were shot or hanged, with the remaining 36 made to dig pits at gunpoint where they were then buried in them up to their necks, Far Cry 3 style, whilst being eaten alive by red ants over the course of days. I don't know what those last 36 people did, but holy fucking shit. Now, there is a commonly circulated factoid about this incident that claims that Nguema had his men dressed up in Santa outfits whilst executing this Christmas spectacle. However, that sadly appears to be completely fictitious. But I don't blame people at all for believing it, because that is entirely in character for Africa. Moving on to 1971, we have Nguema finally starting to formally repeal that pesky constitution that's been holding him back. Not that it really meant much in the first place, because frankly, he was just doing whatever the fuck he wanted anyway. But hey-ho, it's nice to be enabled by a fancy binding document alongside your own functional monopoly on violence. Due to the fact that dictators aren't exactly stable in their early years, paired with the rather nasty divorce from their former colonial overlords, and the fact that said dictator is a fucking dingbat, Nguema became rather paranoid. Not just about the risks of deposition from domestic threats, but from outside forces encroaching upon him. Whether that be the return of the Spanish, or the gringos spreading their freedom where it's not wanted. As such, Nguema needed himself an army. So, how did he go about it? He forced everyone in the country to do military training, with the minimum age for service being 7 years old. And no, that wording is very specific. He didn't conscript everyone into the military, he just forced them to do the training. And seeing as they didn't have enough kit to divvy out to essentially the entire fucking country, Nguema ingeniously solved this issue by making them perform said training with sticks. Yes, really, he conscripted everyone in the country and forced them to become weekend warriors where they would practice drills and combat scenarios with fucking sticks. You know, like we used to do as children. Oh, what's that? You're not a cool cat that wants to play with sticks with your battalion? Well, guess what? If you refuse to take the training, you'll be shot. So in simple terms, you either train to take a bullet, or you take a bullet. Alongside rearing mighty legions of disparate child soldiers, 1971 sees Nguema selflessly elect himself as president for life, and merge all political parties in the country into his own at metaphorical stick point, creating, as it's known in English, the United National Workers' Party. Being a serious party, they not only had a snappy and mildly humorous acronym for their outfit, in this case being PUNT, but they also had an official uniform that had a picture of Nguema over the wearer's heart, and an overly dramatic Pledge of Allegiance that went as such. I, Ghanaian militant of the PUNT, swear by God and on my honour to fight until death if necessary for the territorial integrity of Equatorial Guinea against colonialism, neo-colonialism, imperialism, technological colonialism, separatism, misery and coups. By the way, if you wanted to get anywhere up in the social ladder in Nguema's Guinea, you physically had to be a card-carrying member of the party, with work contracts and tuition fees for academics locked off from you until you were a card-carrying punter. Alongside all of this, they also had a youth wing known as the JMM. And don't worry, they're going to come up later. Fearing that this year of nation building wasn't quite dystopian enough, Nguema then went full Stasi and implemented rewards like promotions or monetary prizes to anyone who could reveal a Spanish spy. This resulted, as you may expect, in a nationwide grip of paranoia and distrust. Because if you, for example, showcased any ability to speak, read or understand Spanish or any other vaguely foreign language, you immediately ran the risk of being made exempt from the next census. You would be shot. Also, since there were cash prizes for pointing out spies, and Equatorial Guinea is a very, very impoverished country, people were just accusing anyone and everyone to make a bit of money. To round out their spell of terror in 1971, Nguema issued the creatively named Law 1, which made the criticism of himself or anyone in his government punishable by death, and if you somehow offended him, well, that would get you 30 years in prison. This, paired with his crippling mental illnesses and irresponsible drug consumption, is indeed irrefutable proof that if he was born in the modern day, Nguema would, as a matter of fact, be a Redditor. Now, of course, with such harsh and repressive policies put in place, Nguema may as well have gone all in on the Nazbol LARP. So, he started oppressing a couple of ethnic groups here and there, as one does. One example is the boobies of Bioko. Boobies. So why did he start oppressing them? Is he more of an arse man? Well, probably not that. In truth, it's because he perceived them to be a smidge too Latinized and spiritually not black enough. Paired with his convergent evolution into pseudo-Stalinism with African characteristics. He hated them because they were generally more represented in the country's intellectual class and as such were much more of a risk to his power. And it seems that others had started to notice such convergent evolution, as Nguema started aligning the country more and more with the Soviet bloc, becoming chummy chairman chuddies with all sorts of paragons of the proletarian paradigm, including being purportedly pally with jovial ducat enjoyer and sussy imposter Kim Il-sung. Keep this in mind because it's going to come up later. Seeing as they were de facto members of the Warsaw Pact, they were obligated to assist their fellow chainbreakers in the liberation of Africa from perfidious capitalist forces. However, seeing as Equatorial Guinea was a tiny, disease-ridden and functionally lawless backwater, they felt the deployment of the mighty Guinean stickmen would be a smidge unwise. As such, their real purpose was merely to be a place for smuggled weapons and ordnances to conveniently disappear before finding its way to wherever there was action on the continent, alongside having a nice and cosy naval base for the Soviets to dock their ships at. Now, seeing as how Nguema was something of a national icon, he needed a cool title or two. So, he formally gave himself a couple. The Great? Nah, that's too boring and conformist. Try Grandmaster of Education, Science and Culture, and the Unique Miracle. Yes, they were his actual titles. After all, this is a dictator. They're meant to be bombastic and fun alongside reprehensibly evil. But the fanning of his ego didn't just stop at the bestowing of corny titles. He renamed himself to Masi Nguema Biogo. And then he renamed the fucking capital island after himself to Masi Nguema Biogo Island. And then he had all of the Catholic churches in the country thank him before performing mass. After all, Nguema is the only person Nguema can trust in Equatorial Guinea. Not even his own government could be trusted. What if they were boobies? Or Spanish? Indeed, not even the cabinet ministers were safe from the strongman's weakening psyche, as he was in a constant state of worsening paranoia. As far as he was concerned, he was being gang-stalked and plotted against by every blade of grass in the country. So of course, he'd be best to keep his cabinet, officials and family on their toes by giving them ad hoc tickets to Malabo Stadium. He even did the classic Pol Pot technique and killed everyone he found who had glasses, because he, once again, thought they were intellectuals. He also banned the word intellectual. As a matter of fact, he banned a lot of things. Other than boring shit like entire political parties, he also outlawed private education, Christianity, Western clothes, fishing, and boats. Like just boats in general. He just banned boats. To which you only need to look at a map of the country to realise how monumentally smooth-brained that is. Also, he went very, very far in enforcing these bans, actively patrolling the coasts to destroy boats, and he would even destroy entire villages if one of the villagers was even rumoured to have a Lacoste jumper. However, he did also declare that being a journalist was punishable by death. So he really wasn't all that bad. And don't even think for a second that if you were to be arrested over this shit that you would just be able to Phoenix Wright your way out of it. Assuming that you weren't just instantly lynched over it and you actually had the misfortune of going to trial, you would very quickly find that it's not only a complete fucking farce, because of course it fucking was, but also that every single person involved in the judicial system is absolutely clueless. Because judges and lawyers were classed as intellectuals, and they had all been fucking executed. So your choices were either you die or you go to Black Beach. And a lot of people chose the former. So how bad is Black Beach? Well, you need only ask a friend of the channel, Simon Mann, because that is where he served part of his sentence. And he really doesn't like talking about it. Now you see, governing a country is actually pretty difficult. As much as we like to rightfully complain about the mind-numbingly arbitrary and Kafkaesque agony that is the bureaucracy of modern countries, one of the reasons it's actually there is so that the government knows what the fuck is happening and, by extension, can plan shit. Very, 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 very badly, but unfortunately, that's the system they've chose. The problem was, in Equatorial Guinea, all of this bureaucracy was all managed by administrators, who were all classed as intellectuals, so guess what fucking happened to them? So as a result, there was a critical shortage of intelligent people to administrate the country. This isn't just an asinine inconvenience for the grubby hands of the state, no, this was an extremely huge problem. The country was physically unable to even perform a basic census. The accountants, those guys good with numbers, intellectuals, exterminated, meaning that no accounting was happening in the country at all, whatsoever. The country didn't even know how much money it had because no one was able to count it. And whenever a brave buckaroo stepped up to perform the functions of government on behalf of Nguema, it would usually end in disaster. Take, for example, the former director of the Institute of Statistics, Saturnin Antonio Ndongo. After managing to cut through the anarchic haze and publishing data like he's meant to, Nguema was very upset with the results. They were far too low, and even though they were factual, a lot of people really don't like being reminded of that pesky thing called reality. So, Nguema invited Saturnin to his Rio Muni villa, where he fucking cut off his hands and feet in order to supposedly help him learn to count. Now, shockingly, this state of affairs wasn't exactly pleasant to live through. People wanted to flee the country. I know, I am also in complete disbelief. So how does our cunning leader tackle the comically intense brain drain and financial flight from the country? Well, in Rio Muni, he had the only road in the country. Now, bear in mind, I didn't say the only road out of the country. I said the only road in the country laced with landmines. And along the border with Gabon, he had what were essentially those steel spikes that police used to knock out tyres placed underneath bushes and stuff. After all, he needed those people for their precious labour. Speaking of which, so nobody wanted to work for quite obvious reasons. So after a particularly low yield of cocoa that was due to be exported, Nguema decided to embrace his inner African warlord and basically restarted the fucking slave trade. Yes, in the 1970s, he had full-blown slaves working in plantations. Only they were harvesting things like cocoa, coffee, and palm oil. This trad way of organising labour resulted in condemnation from basically fucking everyone. In the process, gaining Nguema a new nickname for his whimsical little kingdom. The Dachau of Africa, named after the infamous summer camp. With such brazen violations of their new global order, the United States eventually started taking notice, and on the 10th of September 1978, the United States House of Representatives put forward a motion to formally condemn the former colony for supposed religious persecution and genocide. Utterly ridiculous, I know. Did anything come of it? No, because as the UN seemingly can never fucking figure out for some reason, dictators don't really give a shit about strongly worded letters. But by this point, Nguema was unknowingly in his moonlight years, and as he aged further and further, he decayed into a neurotic ex-user. So, how was our favourite statesman doing during this time? Well, he decided that he needed to return to Rio Muni and embrace his roots. But seeing as he's a real big boy and not an illiterate peasant, he decided to make his previously mentioned villa his main base of operations. He fortified it and started slowly moving all of the nation's gold reserves into it. He actually kept the nation's gold bars in briefcases under his bed. And wait for this one, he had a row of actual decapitated human heads in his living room that he would talk to. He apparently would wander around the compound repeating the names of people he had killed, and on one occasion he actually ordered his servants to prepare a meal and set the table for a luncheon of 8 guests. And upon completing this task, Nguema sat down at the table and ate alone, talking to the empty seats, supposedly conversing with the dead. A lot of this behaviour actually stems from the local practices of the Fang people, who believe that, for example, taking the heads of people you have killed and displaying them in ornamental boxes will act as a talisman of sorts, to ward off evil spirits and bullets and shit. So, with the government being functionally non-existent, with the inner workings of the presidency being so opaque, that people apparently didn't even know that they had a Minister of Finance until Nguema announced that he had just been executed for being a Spanish spy. Yeah, people didn't even know what political positions there were because they all kept getting killed. But instead of being the based libertarian dream that all JRE enjoying Redditors think this state of affairs would be, it was instead an absolute hell on earth. Between everything I've already covered, like, literal fucking slavery. For example, remember the JMM, the Punt Youth Wing? Well, due to the fact that they were organised and weaponised to enforce Nguema's dumb laws and left to mill around, as unpaid children, they decided to start taking up arms and drunkenly executing people on the streets, going village to village, raping women and pillaging homes in a truly Durlavanger-esque display of wanton savagery, made worse by the fact that they were all mostly literal teenagers. Alongside the dystopian laws that send you there, the prisons were also so overcrowded that they regularly had to kill the excess prisoners by firing squad to make space. For God's sake, even Nguema's own presidential guard had to forage for berries and hunt wild game due to the logistics being so badly maintained, and also because food trucks were not able to deliver food anywhere because all of the roads were covered in fucking landmines. It was so bad that Nguema called in a favour with his bestie, and he had his wife and 3 children flee to North Korea under the guise of the wife needing surgery and ensuring a good education for the children. Of course, the madness had to stop eventually. So when Nguema gets yet another intrusive thought to murder his entire family, they ended up acting first, overthrowing him on August the 3rd, 1979, in an actual coup led by disgruntled army officer and Nguema's own nephew, Teodoro Obiang Mbasogo. After a brief power struggle between the plotters and a small cohort of fierce Nguema loyalists, the situation stabilised and a warrant for the arrest of Nguema was issued. The problem was, however, that he just kind of fucked off into the jungle. But not before burning $100 million worth of currency from the country's cash reserves in a presumed fit of petty spite. After a manhunt through the jungle, Nguema was eventually found by an old woman. He was sitting underneath a tree eating sugarcane, which would have probably been one of the most surreal moments in that woman's life. Nguema was then apprehended alongside his car, which had $4 million stuffed in suitcases inside of it. And he was prepped alongside 10 of his cabinet members for a trial before a military tribunal over the charges of embezzlement, treason, human rights violations, mass murder, and genocide, whilst the portrait of his nephew gazed down upon him. Thing is about those 10 ministers, by the way, the tribunal honestly doesn't give a shit about them or their crimes. They were only there to make the tribunal look more important and legitimate before observers, both domestic and international. Shockingly, Nguema was found guilty of all of these charges, and he was subsequently sentenced to death 101 times. He was promptly lifted out of the room and, in a cruel irony, transferred to Black Beach, the prison that he made people disappear into. And he was about to get stuck in there alongside them. There was a slight snag, however. Once at the prison where they were to carry out his execution, the troops ordered to shoot Nguema refused to do so. Not because they were loyal to him, no, not at all. They were actually scared of his ghost. Apparently, whilst being lined up against the wall, Nguema proclaimed that the moment he died, he would become a spooky ghost that would haunt his killers forever. And this threat actually worked. Nobody wanted to shoot him. At least, no natives wanted to shoot him. But good thing there were some very conveniently placed and purchased Moroccan mercenaries just around the corner, who weren't as superstitious about the metaphysical ramifications of Nguema's words.
Will you please kill him? It's pissing me off.
As such, on the 29th of September 1979, at 6 p.m. on the dot, the now 55-year-old Francisco Macias Nguema was lined up against the wall with 6 other ride-or-die brothers and executed by Moroccan firing squad, putting the tyrannical weed wizard down at last. So, where does that leave us now? Well, Nguema's decade of terror could have been governed a little bit better. You know, take for example per capita income. In 1968, upon the country's independence, it averaged out in today's money to $12,845. By 1975, it had lowered a smidge to around $409. After all, having literal fucking slaves can somewhat skew that statistic. Now for some other statistics that are somehow even more harrowing. Infant mortality actually rose to about 60% and is still to this day only slowly lowering. Life expectancy, that was lowered drastically all the way down to 30. How about just raw population? Well, he managed to chase off, kill or disappear around 50,000 people, with half of the country seeing a jail cell at least once in their lives. Only 50,000, that seems rather low. And while, yeah, he's no Mao, but please take into account the fact that the population in 1968 was only 300,000 people. About a sixth of the entire country was killed in just under a decade. That's like World War I Serbia bad. Hell, the case could be made that it could almost be Paraguay bad in terms of its effects. Those are both subjects that are probably worth their own video. Okay, maybe he wasn't the greatest ruler. So what? How about his nephew? Was he any good? Well, he is actually still in charge of the country to this day. But it turns out he wasn't quite the wholesome liberator of the masses that everyone had hoped for. and instead he was functionally just new management. And in fairness, there have also been coup attempts against him, because this was the exact same guy that Simon Mann tried to overthrow. Nguema's kids ended up staying in North Korea, with his daughter Monica leaving and moving down to South Korea and becoming a semi-successful novelist, writing about her experiences of being the only black person in North Korea and how both of her dads, both biological and adoptive, were famously fucked up dictators. So, after all of that, what the fuck can we glean from this entire saga of reprehensible acts? Probably the same lesson that I try and ram down all of your throats every single time I make a video on the subject of power. Stop creating all-powerful positions in government, because one day those positions will be occupied by absolute fucking psychopaths.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody subscribe.